What if I told you that everything you've been taught about death is wrong? What if I could show you a documented conversation between a trained hypnotist and the soul of a man who had just died in one of the most violent ways imaginable? A man crushed under tons of snow and rock in a devastating avalanche. His body was broken, his lungs filled with ice, his physical form destroyed in minutes. But when a skilled hypnotherapist managed to communicate with his soul after death, what he revealed will shatter everything you believe about dying. Today I'm going to share with you the most extraordinary conversation ever recorded between the living and the dead. This isn't fiction, this isn't speculation, this isn't religious doctrine. This is a documented session where a hypnotist spoke directly with the soul of an avalanche victim. And what this soul revealed about death will change how you see life itself. By the end of this video, you'll never fear death again, and you'll understand why this man's experience in the avalanche was nothing like what you'd expect. But first, let me ask you something that might make you uncomfortable. When you think about dying in an avalanche, what images come to mind? Probably terror, suffocation, crushing pain, desperate struggle for survival. The idea of being buried alive under tons of snow and rock represents one of our deepest nightmares about death. If any death should be horrifying and traumatic, it would be this one. Yet what this soul described was the complete opposite of everything we fear about dying. Have you ever wondered what actually happens when we die? Not the religious explanations, not the scientific theories, but the real first-hand experience of crossing from life to death. For centuries, this has been humanity's greatest mystery. We can study the body, we can measure brain activity, we can document the physical process of dying, but we've never been able to ask someone who has actually died what the experience was like. Until now. What I'm about to share with you comes from a documented session of regressive hypnotherapy. The technique is called past life regression, where trained hypnotherapists guide people into deep states of consciousness to access memories beyond their current lifetime. In this particular case, the hypnotist was speaking directly with the soul of a man who had just died in a devastating avalanche. The conversation that followed would challenge everything we think we know about death, pain, and the transition from physical to spiritual existence. This wasn't some peaceful, expected death in a hospital bed surrounded by loved ones. This was sudden, violent, traumatic, the kind of death that haunts our nightmares and drives our deepest fears about mortality. If the experience of dying was going to be terrible anywhere, it would be here, crushed under an avalanche with no time to prepare, no chance to say goodbye, no opportunity for peaceful acceptance. But here's what shocked me the most about this case. This man's soul was still fresh from the experience of dying. His memories were vivid, his understanding clear, his recollection of the transition from physical to spiritual existence completely intact. And what he revealed about his death in that avalanche will transform your understanding of what it means to die, no matter how it happens. The hypnotist asked him a simple, direct question. What was it like to die? His answer wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of describing terror, agony, or the crushing weight of snow and rock, he painted a picture so beautiful, so natural, so peaceful, that it completely reframes our understanding of even the most traumatic deaths. Think about the implications of this for a moment. We live in a world where death is portrayed as the ultimate horror. Movies, books, news stories, medical discussions, they all paint death as something to be fought, feared, and avoided at all costs. We've built entire industries around preventing death, delaying death, hiding from death. The idea of dying in an avalanche represents the absolute worst-case scenario, the kind of death that would justify all our fears about mortality. But what if all of this fear is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what death actually is? What if the physical circumstances of death, whether peaceful or violent, expected or sudden, don't determine the actual experience of dying? What if there's something about the transition from physical to spiritual existence that transcends whatever is happening to the body? This soul's experience suggests that our cultural narrative about death is not just wrong, but completely backwards. We've been taught to see death as the opposite of life, as the enemy of everything good and natural. We judge the quality of a death by its physical circumstances, assuming that violent deaths must be more traumatic than peaceful ones. But what if the soul's experience of dying is completely independent of what happens to the body? Are you ready to hear what this avalanche victim actually said about dying? Because once you understand this, you'll never look at death the same way again, whether it's your own eventual death or the deaths of people you love. The first thing that struck me about his description was how he compared the experience of dying to something we all understand, something beautiful and natural that we've all experienced. He asked the hypnotist a question that immediately created a vivid, peaceful image. Have you ever dived into a deep pool to where it's dark and murky at the bottom? As you come back up towards the surface of the water, it gets lighter and lighter. Then when you break through the surface of the water, there's sunlight all around. Death was like that. Let me pause here because this comparison is absolutely profound. This man died crushed under tons of snow and rock. His physical experience was the opposite of swimming. He was buried, trapped, suffocated. Yet his soul's experience of dying was like gracefully swimming up from the depths of a pool toward light and air. The physical trauma of the avalanche had nothing to do with his actual experience of transitioning from life to death. Think about that for a moment. He's describing death not as an ending, but as an emergence. Not as being crushed down, but as rising up. Not as falling into darkness, but as moving toward light. The deeper you go in water, the darker and more pressured it gets. But when you push up from the bottom, you're moving toward brightness, toward freedom, toward the surface where you can breathe again. This metaphor is profound because it uses something we've all experienced. If you've ever been underwater, you know that feeling of pushing up toward the surface. There's effort involved, but it's not struggle. It's purposeful movement toward something better. You know that air and light are waiting for you above. You trust the process because you've done it before. You're not afraid of breaking through the surface. You anticipate it. According to this avalanche victim, death is exactly like that. But here's what made this revelation even more extraordinary. When the hypnotist asked if this beautiful swimming experience was somehow specific to his death by avalanche, the soul gave an answer that reveals something universal about all deaths, regardless of circumstances. He said, no, it was like that, because I was going from the physical plane to the spiritual plane. As I left my body, it was like coming up through the pool. Then when I reached the spiritual plane, it was like breaking the surface of the water and coming out into sunlight. Do you understand what this means? This wasn't about how he died. This was about the fundamental nature of death itself. Every death, regardless of circumstances, involves this same transition from the dense, heavy physical world to the light, free, spiritual realm. The avalanche didn't determine his experience of dying. The universal process of transitioning from physical to spiritual consciousness did. The crushing snow and rock that destroyed his body were completely irrelevant to his soul's experience of dying. While his body was being traumatized, his soul was experiencing this beautiful emergence into light. The physical and spiritual experiences of death are completely separate. What happens to the body during death has nothing to do with what the soul experiences during the transition. Think about what this means for every person who has ever died violently or traumatically. The car accident victim experiences the same beautiful emergence into light. The person who dies in a fire experiences the same rise toward spiritual freedom. The soldier killed in battle experiences the same natural transition from heavy to light, from physical to spiritual. The circumstances of death, whether peaceful or traumatic, expected or sudden, don't determine the essential experience of dying. This revelation completely changes how we should think about the deaths of our loved ones, especially those who died in accidents, violence, or other traumatic circumstances. Instead of imagining them suffering in their final moments, we can picture them experiencing this beautiful emergence into light. Instead of seeing their deaths as tragedies that cause them pain, we can understand their deaths as natural transitions that they experienced as gracefully as swimming to the surface of a pool. Now I know what you're thinking. What about the pain? What about the trauma of being crushed by tons of snow and rock? Surely that avalanche must have been agonizing. This is where the conversation becomes even more extraordinary, because the hypnotist asked directly about pain, and the answer challenges everything we fear about traumatic deaths. The soul explained that yes, physically it was painful just before losing consciousness of the physical plane, because his body had been injured. But here's the crucial part that changes everything. After losing consciousness, it became very easy and natural. The pain belonged to the body, not to the soul. Once the soul began its transition, the physical suffering was left behind with the physical form. This distinction between body and soul is critical to understanding why even the most traumatic deaths don't have to be the horrifying experiences we imagine. We identify so strongly with our physical bodies that we assume any damage to the body means damage to our essential selves. But according to this Avalanche victim, that's not how it works. The body is like a vehicle we're driving. If the vehicle gets damaged or destroyed, we can step out of it. The damage doesn't transfer to us. Imagine you're driving a car and it gets into a terrible accident. The car might be crushed and destroyed, the metal twisted, the engine ruined. But you can walk away from that wreckage. You are not the car. The car was just carrying you from one place to another. According to this soul, our bodies work the same way. They're vehicles for our consciousness, our essential selves. When the vehicle becomes too damaged to function, we simply step out of it and continue our journey in a different form. So when this man's body was being crushed by the avalanche, his soul was already beginning to separate from that physical trauma. The pain and destruction were happening to his body, but his essential self, his soul, was experiencing something completely different. While his body was being buried under snow and rock, his soul was rising toward light like a swimmer, moving toward the surface of a pool. But then came the statement that completely revolutionized my understanding of death, especially traumatic death. The soul said something so simple yet so profound that it reframes our entire relationship with mortality. He said death is as natural as anything else in life, making love, walking, running, swimming. It is just another part of life. Let that sink in for a moment. Making love, walking, running, swimming. These are some of the most natural, pleasurable, effortless activities we experience as humans. And according to someone who died in one of the most traumatic ways possible, death belongs in that same category. It's not the opposite of life. It's not the enemy of life. It's simply another natural function of existence, like breathing or sleeping. This comparison is especially powerful, coming from someone who died in an avalanche. If anyone had reason to describe death as unnatural, violent, or traumatic, it would be him. But instead, he places death in the same category as the most natural and pleasant human experiences. He's telling us that regardless of how the body dies, the soul's experience of death is always natural, always easy, always as comfortable as any other natural bodily function. Think about making love. It's intimate, natural, pleasurable, connecting, transformative. It's something you surrender to rather than fight against. It's an experience that takes you beyond your ordinary consciousness into something transcendent. It requires trust, letting go, allowing something larger than your individual will to take over. And according to this avalanche victim, death has all of these same qualities, even when the body is experiencing trauma. When you make love, you don't approach it with fear and resistance. You approach it with anticipation, trust and willingness to surrender to the experience. You know it will be pleasurable. You know it will connect you with something beyond your individual self. You know you'll emerge from it changed, renewed, more complete than when you entered it. This soul is telling us that death deserves the same trust, the same anticipation, the same willingness to surrender, regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. The soul went even further with this concept. He said, "There's no such thing as dying. You just go on to a different stage of your life. Dying is pleasant." No such thing as dying. Let me repeat that. According to someone who experienced what we call death in one of the most violent ways possible, dying doesn't actually exist. It's just a transition to a different stage of existence, like moving from childhood to adulthood, or from being single to being married. Think about other major transitions in your life. When you graduated from school, you didn't cease to exist as a student. You became something new. When you moved to a new city, you didn't stop being yourself. You entered a new phase of your existence. When you recovered from a serious illness, you didn't lose your previous identity. You expanded into a larger version of yourself. According to this soul, death is the same kind of transition. You don't stop existing. You don't lose yourself. You simply move into a new phase of your eternal existence. And he described it as pleasant, not just tolerable, not just bearable, but actually pleasant. When was the last time you heard death described as pleasant, especially death by avalanche? This challenges every horror story, every fearful image, every nightmare we've been conditioned to associate with dying. Pleasant means enjoyable, agreeable, satisfying. It means something you might actually look forward to, like a vacation or a reunion with loved ones or a return home after a long journey. But the conversation revealed something even more empowering about our control over the dying experience. The hypnotist asked about pain again, wanting to understand if death itself is painful. The soul's response gives us incredible insight into our power during even the most traumatic deaths. He said, "Death is not painful unless you have need of pain. For the most part, there is no pain unless it is wished for. It can be extremely painful if you wish it to be, or if you feel you have need of it in order to teach you a lesson. But you can separate yourself from that at all times." Did you catch that? Even in an avalanche, even in the most traumatic circumstances, we have choice in our experience of death. We can separate ourselves from pain at all times. This isn't about being tough or brave. This is about understanding that we have more control over our dying experience than we ever imagined. The soul explained that this separation of body and soul during times of pain is available to everyone, no matter how connected they are with what's happening to their physical form. This concept of choice in our dying experience is revolutionary, especially when applied to traumatic deaths. It means that even if our bodies are experiencing an avalanche, a car accident, a fire, or any other trauma, our essential selves, our souls, can choose to step back from that trauma. It's like having a remote control for your consciousness. If the experience becomes too intense, you can change the channel. You can observe what's happening to your body without being overwhelmed by it. The hypnotist pressed further, asking if the actual leaving of the body is painful. The answer was definitive. No. The transition is one of ease rather than duress. Pain comes from the body. The spirit feels no pain except remorse. Think about what this means for someone dying in an avalanche. Physical pain is a function of having a physical body. When the spirit separates from that body, physical pain becomes irrelevant. It's like taking off tight shoes after a long day. The discomfort was never really part of you. It was just something you were experiencing temporarily. The only pain a spirit can feel is remorse, the feeling that they could have done something more in their physical life. But even this isn't the torturous suffering we imagine. It's more like the gentle sadness you might feel when leaving a beautiful vacation, wishing you had appreciated it more while you were there. It's not punishment or torture. It's simply the natural reflection that comes when you look back on any experience and see how it could have been even better. But here's perhaps the most empowering revelation of all. The hypnotist asked if it's possible to leave the body before actual death occurs and let the body suffer the pain without the soul experiencing it. The answer was yes. The soul explained that every person has the choice of whether to stay and experience the physical trauma or to leave early and simply observe from a distance. This means that even in an avalanche, even in the most traumatic deaths, we have an escape route. We don't have to suffer through every moment of physical destruction. We can choose to step back and watch, like stepping out of a movie theater if the film becomes too intense. This option is available to everyone, regardless of their spiritual beliefs or preparation. It's not something you have to earn or learn. It's a natural ability that every soul possesses. Imagine what this means for people facing terminal illnesses, for soldiers in combat, for anyone in a situation where death might be traumatic. They don't have to endure every moment of physical suffering. They can choose when to step back, when to separate their consciousness from their body's experience. They can observe their death rather than being overwhelmed by it. Now let me share what this means for how we live our lives. If death is truly as natural as making love, if it's truly a pleasant transition to a different stage of existence, if we truly have control over our experience of it, even in the most traumatic circumstances, then what does this change about how we approach life? First, it means we can stop living in fear of traumatic death. Fear of death is really fear of the unknown, fear of pain, fear of ending. But if death is none of those things, even in an avalanche, then that fear is based on false information. It's like being afraid of going to sleep because you think you'll never wake up, when in reality, sleep is just a temporary state that refreshes you for the next day. How much of your life is controlled by fear of traumatic death? How many activities do you avoid because you're afraid of accidents? How many adventures do you skip because you're worried about avalanches, car crashes, or other violent deaths? How many risks do you refuse to take because somewhere in the back of your mind you're terrified of dying traumatically? If even the most traumatic deaths are actually natural, pleasant transitions, then most of our safety-seeking behavior is unnecessary. Second, it means we can start making decisions based on what truly matters rather than on avoiding dangerous deaths. How many opportunities do we miss because we're afraid of dying in accidents? How many mountains do we refuse to climb? How many adventures do we skip? How many risks do we avoid because death feels like this terrible threat hanging over everything? If even avalanche death is actually a natural, pleasant transition, then we can live with much more freedom and courage. Think about the career you might pursue if you weren't afraid of the risks involved. Think about the adventures you might take if you weren't afraid of accidents. Think about the places you might visit if you weren't worried about natural disasters. Think about the activities you might try if you weren't terrified of traumatic death. When even the worst possible deaths stop being ultimate threats, everything else becomes manageable. Third, it means we can approach the traumatic deaths of loved ones with less devastation and more understanding. Yes, we'll still grieve the loss of their physical presence in our lives, but we can take comfort in knowing that even if they died in accidents, violence, or natural disasters, their transition was natural and pleasant, that they moved to a different stage of existence rather than suffering through trauma. This doesn't minimize the reality of grief or the pain of loss. Losing someone you love is still difficult because you miss their physical presence, their voice, their touch, their companionship. But it changes the nature of that grief when the death was traumatic. Instead of grieving for their suffering, you're grieving for your own loss. Instead of worrying about what they experienced in their final moments, you can focus on honoring what they meant to you. Instead of being haunted by images of their traumatic death, you can picture them experiencing that beautiful emergence into light. The soul in this session gave us a practical way to understand this. He suggested that if people are worried about death, they should go to a place in a river that has a deep pool. They should dive down to the bottom of the pool, then push up vigorously with their feet and come plunging up to the surface. He said death is like that, even death in an avalanche. This is something you can actually do. You can experience a version of what death feels like, even traumatic death. Next time you're swimming, try this exercise. Dive deep, stay at the bottom for a moment in the dark, heavy water, then push up powerfully toward the surface. Pay attention to how it feels to emerge from the dark, pressured depths into the light, airy world above. That feeling of emergence, of relief, of natural transition, that's what this soul says death feels like, even when the body is being crushed by an avalanche. The man who died in that avalanche gave us an incredible gift. He showed us that even our worst fears about traumatic death are unfounded. He revealed that the transition we've been taught to dread is actually something we can anticipate with naturalness and peace, regardless of the circumstances that bring it about. This doesn't mean we should seek death or be careless with life. Physical existence is precious and meaningful, but it does mean we can live without the shadow of death fear darkening every moment, even fear of traumatic death. We can embrace adventures, take meaningful risks, and live boldly, knowing that even if the worst happens, our souls will experience a natural, pleasant transition. The next time you're afraid of death, especially traumatic death, remember this avalanche victim's words. Remember that while his body was being crushed, his soul was swimming toward light. Remember that death is described by someone who experienced it traumatically as natural as making love, as pleasant as breaking through water into sunlight, as easy as any other natural function of life. This is perhaps the most liberating truth you'll ever encounter. Even traumatic death isn't your enemy. It's not your failure. It's not your ending. It's simply the next natural step in your eternal journey, as beautiful and effortless as rising from the depths of a pool into warm sunlight, regardless of what happens to your physical body. Take a deep breath and let that truth settle into your consciousness. You are not racing toward disaster, even if you die in an accident. You are moving toward a transition so natural and pleasant that someone who died in an avalanche compared it to the most beautiful experiences of human life. This changes everything. And now that you know this truth, you can live with a freedom and courage that most people never experience. The fear of traumatic death dies today, and in its place, you can embrace life with the full knowledge that whatever happens to your body, your soul's transition will be natural, pleasant, and beautiful. That's the gift this avalanche victim gave us. That's the truth that will set you free.